The truth crashes down like corporate glass ceilings. In a Los Angeles skyscraper where power meets poverty daily, Janitor Confronts Billionaire unfolds as Michael utters 5 devastating words. "I'm your real dad, Daniel." The billionaire's legs give way beneath the weight of revelation, his perfectly constructed reality shattering into fragments sharper than his designer suit's edges. Michael pressed the cloth deeper into the smudge on the glass door, his weathered hands working with practiced precision on the 44th floor of Paragon Industries. The corporate headquarters of Los Angeles' fastest-growing tech company gleamed with the cold perfection he'd maintained for 5 years, polishing surfaces that reflected everything except the truth he carried within him. Each day, he moved through these corridors like a ghost, invisible to the suits and skirts that hurried past with coffee and spreadsheets, their eyes looking through him as though the space he occupied was merely empty air. The janitor's uniform, blue-gray and forgettable, was the perfect camouflage in a world obsessed with designer labels and status symbols, allowing him to observe without being observed, to exist at the periphery of a world that would never welcome him to its center. Today would be different, though. Today, the invisible man would finally be seen. Michael had rehearsed the words 1,000 times during midnight shifts, whispering them to empty conference rooms and vacant offices when the building stood silent and dark. At 63, his face mapped with lines of hardship and regret, he'd spent decades carrying the weight of his decision, a decision made in desperate poverty when he was barely more than a boy himself. The memory of that day still burned bright. The smell of antiseptic hospital corridors, the social worker's practiced sympathy, the pen trembling in his hand as he signed away his flesh and blood. He'd told himself it was for the best, that a child deserved more than a father who couldn't keep the lights on or put food on the table, who worked 3 jobs and still came up short every month. Fate had a twisted sense of humor, Michael reflected, as he gathered his cleaning supplies and prepared to make his way to the executive suite. 5 years ago, when he'd taken this job after a lifetime of manual labor had left his back perpetually aching and his prospects dwindling, he hadn't known who ran Paragon Industries. The name Daniel Harrington meant nothing to him until he saw the man's face in the company newsletter, a face that echoed his own younger self with such striking similarity that Michael had dropped the paper as though it had burned him. The familiar eyes, the distinctive angle of the jawline, the way the left eyebrow arched slightly higher than the right. These weren't coincidences, but biological inheritance, genetic code passed from father to son despite 35 years of separation. For months afterward, Michael had waged an internal war, debating whether to speak up or remain silent. He'd watched Daniel from afar, observed the billionaire CEO's confident stride through the hallways, listened to speeches at company gatherings from the back of the room, studied interviews and articles that painted the portrait of a self-made man with no family connections who'd built an empire through sheer brilliance and determination. The story never mentioned adoption, never hinted at the truth that Michael alone possessed. Sometimes, in his darkest moments of doubt, Michael wondered if coming forward would do more harm than good, if revealing the truth would only destroy the carefully constructed narrative of Daniel's life without adding anything of value to replace it. The decision had finally crystallized last week when Michael overheard Daniel speaking to his assistant about plans for a company-wide charity initiative focused on supporting children in foster care. "Everyone deserves to know where they come from," Daniel had said, his voice carrying through the partially open door as Michael emptied the nearby trash bin, moving with the practiced silence that had become second nature. "Identity is the foundation of everything." Those words, spoken by a son who didn't know he was being heard by the father he'd never known, had resolved Michael's uncertainty like a key turning in a lock. Today, as the executive floor emptied for lunch and the corner office would stand momentarily unguarded, Michael would finally cross the invisible boundary that had kept him separated from his son for more than 3 decades. As the elevator carried him upward toward the inevitable confrontation, Michael felt strangely calm, as though he were watching himself from outside his body. The cleaning cart creaked slightly as he pushed it down the carpeted hallway of the executive floor, past the desk of Daniel's executive assistant who, right on schedule, had left for her lunch break. The polished wooden door to the corner office stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, Michael could see Daniel standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the door as he looked out over the sprawling city, a kingdom he'd built without ever knowing the identity of the man who had given him life. Michael left his cart in the hallway, wiped his suddenly damp palms against his uniform pants, and with a deep breath that seemed to draw in all his remaining courage, pushed open the door to face the moment that would forever alter 2 lives that should never have been separate in the first place. Daniel Harrington stood framed against the Los Angeles skyline, his tailored suit a stark silhouette against the panoramic view his success had purchased. From this height, the city sprawled before him like a living entity, pulsing with ambition and possibility, a fitting backdrop for a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. At 35, he had achieved what most couldn't accomplish in several lifetimes, built a technology empire from a college dorm room idea, revolutionized digital communications, and amassed a fortune that placed him firmly among the business elite whose portraits graced the covers of financial magazines. The corner office, with its minimalist furniture and carefully curated art, was merely one symbol of a journey defined by relentless drive and an uncompromising vision that had propelled him from obscurity to prominence through sheer force of will and intellect. When the door opened behind him, Daniel assumed it was Jessica returning early from lunch, with another urgent matter requiring his attention. There was always something demanding immediate action, always another decision only he could make. Without turning, he continued studying the projections on his tablet, the quarterly numbers that would reassure nervous board members and silence the critics who'd been predicting Paragon's decline since its meteoric rise began. "Whatever it is can wait until after the Westridge call," he said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone unaccustomed to being contradicted. "Unless the building's on fire, I need 20 minutes without interruptions." The silence that followed was unusual enough to make him turn, expecting to see Jessica's apologetic expression, but finding instead the weathered face of a stranger in a janitor's uniform standing just inside his office door with an expression of such intensity that Daniel instinctively straightened. The initial flash of annoyance, who was this maintenance worker interrupting his preparation time, quickly gave way to confusion as Daniel registered something disconcertingly familiar about the man's features. Before he could speak, demand an explanation for this intrusion into his sanctuary of power, the older man took 2 steps forward and spoke words that would alter the foundation of Daniel's carefully constructed reality. "My name is Michael Reeves," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. 35 years ago, I signed papers giving up my son for adoption because I couldn't provide for him." The older man's eyes, a shade of green identical to the ones Daniel saw every morning in the mirror, held his gaze with uncomfortable directness as he delivered the sentence that would collapse the world around them both. "I'm your real father, Daniel." The words struck with physical force, seeming to displace the oxygen in the room and replace it with something unbreathable. Daniel felt his body respond before his mind could fully process the claim, his heart hammering against his ribs, a cold sweat breaking across his skin, the blood draining from his face as though a plug had been pulled. The room tilted sideways in his perception, the familiar office suddenly alien territory as the floor beneath him seemed to shift like tectonic plates realigning. He tried to speak, to dismiss this absurd claim with the decisive authority he wielded in boardrooms and negotiations, but his voice failed him completely. The tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering to the hardwood floor as his legs gave way beneath him, knees buckling as though the strings holding him upright had been abruptly cut by the janitor's impossible declaration. Michael moved with surprising speed for a man his age, crossing the distance between them to catch Daniel before he completely collapsed. Strong hands that had spent decades in manual labor, gripped his arms, guiding him to the nearby leather sofa where Daniel sank down, his mind racing to reject what his body had already accepted as truth. "This is impossible," he finally managed, the words emerging, strangled and unfamiliar from his throat. "My parents died in a car accident when I was in college. I was adopted as an infant by Robert and Elizabeth Harrington. There's been some mistake." But even as he spoke the denial, Daniel's analytical mind, the same brilliant intellect that had built algorithms and predicted market trends, was processing the undeniable physical similarities between himself and the janitor. The distinctive jawline they shared, the set of their shoulders, the same slight asymmetry to their eyebrows that gave them both a permanently questioning expression. "There's no mistake," Michael said quietly, remaining standing but keeping his distance now, as though recognizing the need to give Daniel space to process this revelation. "I've watched you for 5 years, trying to find the courage to tell you the truth. I've worked here, cleaning your office after hours, emptying your trash, polishing your awards, all while carrying this secret." He gestured to a framed magazine cover on the wall, Fortune's Entrepreneur of the Year, featuring Daniel's photograph, and added with unmistakable pride, mixing with regret, "I knew the moment I saw your picture in the company newsletter. A father knows his son even after 35 years. The simplicity of the statement, delivered without dramatic flair or emotional manipulation, carried a weight of authenticity that penetrated Daniel's instinctive skepticism, triggering memories of questions he'd asked his adoptive parents that had never received satisfying answers. The silence that stretched between them was filled with 3.5 decades of absence, birthdays uncelebrated together, achievements unwitnessed, struggles unshared. A chasm of lost time that seemed unbridgeable in this moment of initial recognition. Outside the window, Los Angeles continued its relentless pace, unaware that in this office, time had temporarily suspended as two lives that should have been intertwined from the beginning struggled to find their first points of connection. Daniel studied the man, claiming to be his father. Seeing beyond the janitor's uniform to the dignity in his posture, the intelligence in his eyes, the emotional restraint that suggested a lifetime of practiced self-control. Something profound and primal stirred within Daniel's chest. Not acceptance, not yet, but recognition of a possibility too significant to dismiss without investigation, too personal to evaluate with his usual clinical detachment. "Get out!" The words escaped through Daniel's clenched teeth, each syllable sharp enough to cut, his composure reassembling itself like armor over vulnerability. 5 minutes had passed in silence as he'd processed the janitor's claim, his brilliant mind racing through possibilities, probabilities, and the devastating implications if this unthinkable revelation proved true. Now, standing with his back rigid and hands clenched into fists at his sides, Daniel gestured toward the door with a jerking motion that betrayed his barely contained turmoil. "Whatever you're after, money, a position, some kind of twisted revenge, you won't get it from me. Security will escort you from the building. And if you ever approach me again, I'll have you arrested for harassment." The threat hung in the air between them, a desperate attempt to re-establish the power dynamic that had been catastrophically inverted by Michael's simple declaration of paternity. Michael neither moved toward the door nor reacted to the threat, his weathered face reflecting not anger, but a deep, patient sadness that somehow enraged Daniel further. "I don't want your money," the older man said quietly, reaching slowly into the pocket of his uniform to withdraw a folded envelope yellowed with age. "I've lived without it for 63 years. I can manage the rest of my days the same way. What I couldn't live with anymore was the knowledge that my son believes a lie about his origins." He placed the envelope on the glass coffee table between them, his calloused fingertips lingering for a moment on the paper as though reluctant to surrender its contents. "Your birth certificate, your adoption papers, my signature releasing you to become someone else's son because I believed they could give you what I couldn't. Education, opportunity, stability. Daniel stared at the envelope as though it might spontaneously combust, unwilling to touch it, yet unable to ignore its presence. His throat constricted around words he couldn't form, emotions he'd never allowed himself to experience surging like a tidal wave against the carefully constructed barriers of his psyche. Adopted, the word he'd always known, but somehow never fully processed in its deepest implications. Robert and Elizabeth had told him when he was 12, an awkward conversation that emphasized how specially chosen he was, how deeply wanted, but they'd never mentioned his biological parents, deflecting his questions with vague references to closed records and privacy laws. He'd stopped asking eventually, channeling his energy into academic achievement and later business success, building an identity defined by accomplishment rather than origins. "I was 19 when you were born." Michael continued into the stretched silence, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, decades of unspoken truth finally finding release. "Your mother died in childbirth. Complications they couldn't control. Carmen Vasquez. She was beautiful, brilliant, studying to become a teacher when we met. She never even got to hold you." His voice cracked slightly on these words, the first break in his composed exterior. "I was working 3 jobs, living in a room barely bigger than that closet over there, with no family to help. The hospital bills alone would have taken years to pay off. When the social worker talked about adoption, about giving you a chance at a better life with parents who were ready." He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless surrender to circumstances long past. "I thought I was doing the right thing for you. I've spent 35 years wondering if that was the biggest mistake of my life." The raw honesty in Michael's voice penetrated Daniel's defensive anger, forcing him to recognize the courage this confrontation required, not just today, but every day for 5 years, as Michael cleaned the offices of a son who didn't know him, maintaining proximity without recognition, watching from the periphery of a life he'd helped create but couldn't claim. The realization sent Daniel pacing across his office, past the wall of achievements, framed degrees, awards, magazine covers, that suddenly seemed hollow in the face of this fundamental revelation about his identity. He stopped before the large photograph of Robert and Elizabeth Harrington at his company's launch party, their proud smiles directed at a son who wasn't biologically theirs, but whom they'd raised as their own. They were good parents, he said finally, surprising himself with the first voluntary information he'd offered. "They supported everything I did, believed in me when nobody else did." Michael nodded, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth in a way that Daniel suddenly recognized as identical to his own expression when conceding a point in negotiations. "I know they were. I researched them after I found you. Learned everything I could about the family who raised my son. Robert Harrington, investment banker, Elizabeth Harrington, philanthropy chair for half the charities in Southern California. They gave you advantages I never could have dreamed of providing." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a simple acknowledgement of fact, tinged with gratitude. "I saw how they looked at you in that photograph, with real love. That's all I ever wanted for you, even if it meant I couldn't be the one to give it." The sincerity in Michael's words dismantled another layer of Daniel's resistance, forcing him to confront the possibility that this man's motivations might be exactly what he claimed. Not financial gain or disruption, but simply connection, recognition, the healing of an old wound that had never properly closed. Daniel found himself drawn back to the envelope on the coffee table, finally picking it up with fingers that trembled slightly despite his efforts at control. The paper felt fragile in his hands, a physical manifestation of a truth that had existed all along without his knowledge, waiting to be discovered when he was ready, or perhaps when Michael was finally ready to reveal it. With a deep breath that did little to steady the sudden racing of his heart, Daniel carefully opened the sealed flap and removed documents that would either confirm or disprove everything about the foundation of his identity. The documents spread across Daniel's desk like fragments of an identity shattered and awaiting reassembly. Birth certificate listing Michael Anthony Reeves as father and Carmen Elena Vasquez as mother. Adoption papers with Michael's signature releasing parental rights. Hospital records documenting Carmen's death during childbirth complications, and a single photograph of a young man holding a newborn with an expression of devastated love. 3 hours had passed since Michael's revelation, hours filled with questions, answers, and periods of heavy silence as Daniel methodically verified every detail, his analytical mind requiring concrete evidence before his heart could begin the more difficult process of acceptance. Outside his office, Jessica had returned from lunch to find the door uncharacteristically locked. Her concerned texts met with unprecedented instructions to cancel all afternoon appointments, a directive so unlike Daniel's usual prioritization of business that she'd nearly called security before receiving his assurance that he was fine, just dealing with an unexpected personal matter. "I tracked down your adoptive parents 2 years after I signed the papers," Michael explained. Seated now across from Daniel at the desk, the formal distance between them gradually diminishing as truth replaced suspicion. "I told myself I just needed to know you were okay, being raised by good people. I found your house, Brentwood Mansion, grounds that seemed to go on forever, a childhood so different from what I'd known growing up in East Los Angeles tenements." He paused, running a hand over his face, the gesture revealing both exhaustion and relief at finally sharing this long-carried secret. "I saw you playing in the front yard with your adoptive mother. You were about 2, chasing a ball across the lawn, laughing. You looked happy, healthy, loved. I told myself that was enough, that I'd made the right choice. And I drove away promising myself I wouldn't interfere in the life you were building without me." Daniel studied the photograph of his biological parents, Michael so young, barely more than a boy himself, and Carmen captured only in a separate graduation portrait Michael had preserved. "Why come back now, after all this time?" he asked, the question emerging without the earlier hostility, but weighted with genuine confusion. "Why work as a janitor in my company for 5 years before saying anything? You could have approached me directly at any time." The implications of Michael's long silence on the periphery of his life both disturbed and moved Daniel. The patience it represented, the humble persistence, the willingness to exist in proximity without recognition, simply to be near a son who didn't know him. It was so contrary to the transactional relationships that dominated Daniel's world, where every interaction came with explicit expectations and clearly defined objectives. Michael's answer came slowly, thoughtfully, as though he'd asked himself the same question countless times over the years. "After your adoptive parents died, and I saw the news about your growing success, I tried to convince myself you didn't need complications. A biological father appearing out of nowhere, disrupting the narrative you'd built about yourself. But the truth is, I was scared." The admission visibly cost him, pride struggling against honesty in the set of his shoulders. What could I possibly offer someone like you? What right did I have to insert myself into your life after giving up that privilege when you were born?" He gestured around the opulent office with its symbols of power and success. "Look at what you've built, who you've become. And look at me, a janitor with an 8th grade education who spent his life cleaning up after people more successful than himself." The raw vulnerability in Michael's confession struck Daniel with unexpected force, penetrating the armor of skepticism and self-protection he'd maintained through their conversation. For the first time, he truly saw the man behind the revelation, not just as a biological connection or a disruption to his understanding of himself, but as a person who had made an agonizing choice from limited options and lived with the consequences every day since. The realization shifted something fundamental in Daniel's perception, the beginning of empathy where only shock and resistance had existed before. "You never remarried? Had other children?" he asked, suddenly curious about the life his biological father had lived in the decades of their separation, wondering what kind of man had made the choice to give up his only child. A shadow passed across Michael's features, a glimpse of old grief still carried close to the surface. "No, there was no one after Carmen. Maybe that was punishment I assigned myself, or maybe some loves you only get once in a lifetime." He straightened in his chair, pride returning to his posture as he continued. "I worked construction mostly, built half the skyscrapers in downtown LA with these hands, including this one. The irony didn't escape me when I applied for the maintenance position here after my back couldn't handle the heavy work anymore. Cleaning the building I helped construct, watching over the sun I helped create, both from a distance, both without recognition." There was no self-pity in his tone, only a quiet dignity that commanded respect despite his humble position. As Daniel listened, he found himself mentally recalibrating everything he thought he knew about privilege, sacrifice, and the true nature of success. His entire life had been built on metrics, quantifiable achievements, measurable progress, tangible results. Yet here, before him, sat a man whose greatest act of love could only be measured by its absence, a father who had chosen to disappear so his son could thrive. The profound selflessness of this decision collided with everything Daniel had learned in the competitive worlds of elite education and cutthroat business, where calculated self-interest was not just normalized, but celebrated as the engine of achievement. For the first time, he found himself wondering what kind of man he might have become with Michael's influence, perhaps less materially successful, but possibly richer in ways that couldn't be captured on a balance sheet or stock valuation. The silence between them had evolved from hostile to contemplative, charged now with mutual recognition of a connection that transcended the years of separation. Outside the office windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Los Angeles landscape, illuminating both the gleaming towers of success and the humbler structures where lives like Michael's played out in relative obscurity. Two worlds that had seemed entirely separate until today. Daniel finally reached across the desk, a gesture that bridged more than physical distance as he extended his hand toward the man who had given him life, then sacrificed his own happiness to ensure his son's future. "I can't promise I understand everything yet, or that I know what happens next," he said, his voice steadier than it had been all afternoon, "but I think it's time we properly met. I'm Daniel, your son, and I'd like to know the man my father really is.